review as to the approaches to co-teaching and some of the tools that we shared. So we all have a common conceptual framework, if you will. And as was mentioned earlier, we are planning for you to be engaged, to be involved. We'll have lots of opportunities to respond with chat, some breakout opportunities, and poll. And very important is that you have access to that handout. So if you've downloaded the handout, we would like you to have 3 different colored highlighters for some activities that we'll be doing. And if not, you can use the highlighter on your device. So what are we going to do today?
What are we going to do today? Well, today we have 5 objectives for you. First, as Rich suggested, we are going to look at implementation science, research, review it a little bit with you, as well as those 4 predominant approaches to co-teaching, together with their benefits and any of the associated cautions that go with it. We also will review how co-teaching tools facilitate trust, communication, role clarification, and how planning time can be used by co-teachers and the coaches that support them. Again, we'll review a conceptual framework as to how inclusive education, DI, co-teaching, and multi-tiered systems of support work together to ensure access and success for all students, including students who are dually identified. However, the bulk of our time is going to be focused on, as Rich suggested, learning about and analyzing, as well as using with those highlights as part of it in advance, that's co-teaching instructional observation form. And along with that, you'll have the opportunity to see some modeling of effective coaching, and you'll have that practice using the coaching session mastery checklist, so they can learn about the elements of an effective coaching session. So we started with implementation science, and we said we're going to quickly review. So what is implementation science? It's the study of how any scientific knowledge, principles, practices are used and not used in the real world. And it came about because regardless of what area we were looking at, whether it's medicine or engineering or education, there was a persistent observation of this gap between what the research says is best practice and what actually was happening in the field. So in implementation science, we try to identify those factors that affect people's ability to actually use a recommended practice. And we'll be providing you with some tools that will help you with that.
So what are those tools, or factors rather, that are related to the successful use of educational best practices? Well, Fixon and colleagues tell us that it is these 4. So, excuse me 1 second here. All right. So, oops. Professionals have to receive training that includes coaching and frequent performance-based feedback. Obviously, the reason that we're all here today focused on this topic in this session. Organizations need to provide administrative support and the correct infrastructure to support ongoing coaching. So we are so excited that there are so many coaches and administrators that are part of this topic, part of this presentation today. The third factor is that the communities and the consumers need to be fully involved in choosing specific programs and practices. And then we have to look at and assure that our federal as well as state and local policies, funding streams, regulations create the environment that will support implementation.
So, we do know a fair amount about the effectiveness of different types of training, and you'll see them listed on the left-hand side of this slide. So educators, as you know, experience everything from attending a presentation with discussion, the first item, to experiencing experiences that add in demonstrations of the practice being taught, to trainings where participants get to actually practice and receive feedback during the training, and then where training is supplemented, that last row, with on-site coaching and with the actual students that the teacher is working with in the classroom. So we'd like you to look at that right-hand column, use in the classroom. and estimate the percentage of people who participate in a professional development, each one of these 4 types of training, who actually end up regularly implementing the desired practices in the classroom for each of these. And how are we going to do that?
Well, we're going to do it with a waterfall chat.
Love it.
In fact, there will be 4 of them. So in a moment, we're going to ask you to think about, if you have presentation and discussion, what percentage of that content of that training gets used in a classroom? So in a waterfall chat, if you're not familiar with it, you're going to type in your answers in the chat box, but you will refrain from hitting the return key until prompted. And then when prompted, all of our responses come together. So without hitting the return key, take that guess, that estimate that Jackie was talking about. What percentage of the content from a training that is just presentation discussion do you believe transfers over into the classroom? Type your percentage in the chat box. Again, refrain from hitting the return key until prompted. While you're typing and not hitting return, I noticed the question in the chat box: will you have access to the slide deck? We will, following the presentation, give you access to it in PDF format. Okay. Why don't you hit the return key?
Wow, quite a range.
Yeah, we're ranging from 5 to 10, 20, 50, 15, 75, 60, 25.
40, 30, 50.
And the answer is,
oh, we were going to do
all 4. We were going to do all 4. Oh, well, I think I messed that up. So I thought they're going to fly one at a time. Well, I guess that shortens our waterfall chat sequence.
Yeah. But now you know what a waterfall chat is, and we're going to use it again in this session, at least one more time. So you see the data here. As Joyce and Showers have documented, since the early 80s, we get very little transfer of professional learning back into the classroom without real-time observation, coaching, and performance-based feedback. Look at those numbers. 0.05%, but 95% with that coaching. So your participation in this training session on coaching and performance-based feedback and the use of what you will learn today will be critical to the successful implementation of co-teaching within your sphere of influence.
So now let's transition to looking at the 4 predominant approaches to co-teaching. And what we want to quickly review with you is the similarities, the differences, the advantages, and the cautions associated with each of the 4 approaches. If we are going to coach people in co-teaching, we have to be very facile with understanding the similarities, differences, advantages, and cautions so that we're helping people to use and not abuse the co-teaching approaches so that we can achieve that research promise if we do it and do it right. There is a time and a place for all 4 co-teaching approaches. Now, in your handout, we've given you a blank template that we often, if we have a longer period of time with you, would go through each of these approaches in much more detail with much more video footage. And you would be filling this graphic organizer in as you went along. Now, you'll note on it that for us, we're using the terms supportive, parallel, complementary, and team. Because in the early 90s, the National Center for Educational Restructuring and Inclusion did a national survey going to exemplary districts that were implementing inclusion. And they asked them, how come you're successful? And one of the variables that clearly came up for them was that they were doing co-teaching. And that research used and defined these 4 approaches. Some of you may be more familiar with the work of Marilyn Friend and Lynn Cook. So this slide gives you a little bit of the similarities between them. When we use the term supportive, They use one teaches, one observes, or one teaches and one assists. We both use the term parallel. We break that down into various representations, or as we call it, faces of parallel co-teaching. Something that we talk about that they do not is this notion of complementary co-teaching, and we both talk about team. So one thing that is common to all four approaches of parallel, complementary, and team is that it must involve two or more people who share responsibility for instructing all the students assigned to a classroom. Two or more. Quite frankly, the majority of co-teaching arrangements are of two, but we certainly have seen 3, 4, 5 people in co-teaching arrangements. We also want to emphasize the term people, because for us, we do not want to delimit our view of who are the resources available to us, and also really represent what we see in our nation's classrooms. The most predominant co-teaching partnerships across our country are gen ed teachers with special educators, rapidly catching up general ed teachers who are working with English learning specialists, but there are all different kinds of combinations. You can have 2 gen ed teachers co-teaching. You could have related service personnel, like speech and language pathologists co-teaching. You can have paraeducators co-teaching. We see that frequently, obviously under the direction and supervision of a teacher, right? But they have been incredibly beneficial to the instructional personnel as well as the students. Speaking of students, we've worked with high schools where we've had up to 50 high school students enrolled in 3-credit elective course in co-teaching, and then they're paired to co-teach across grades 9 through 12. So it is 2 or more people. Now, when we support students who are duly identified, we support our special ed students, our English learners, any student. When you bring together content teachers, masters of content, and the interventionists who are masters of access, they pool that skill set for the benefit of all the students that are there. It is important to understand when we say instruction, it's the complete instructional act. Co-plan, co-teach, reflect, assess, modify. And it is shared responsibility for all the students assigned to a classroom. It is never, these are mine and those are yours.
Regardless of which of the approaches we're using, all 4 approaches require trust, communication, role clarification, coordination of effort, and common planning time. And as you move from supportive to parallel to complementary to team, each one of these increases, as you'll see as we describe them further.
Okay. As a resource for you, we have provided you with a completed graphic organizer that looks at the similarities, the unique features or differences, the advantages, and the cautions. And you will see that on pages 5 and 6 of the handout. So what we do need to share with you is, of course, you're well aware that we live in a very interesting time. So we have places where teachers are still teaching students face-to-face, a lot of places where it is virtual, and places where it's a hybrid. We've been, since March, continuing to train people in co-teaching, to do observations, to do the coaching, the debrief sessions. And at this point, we've literally asked hundreds of co-teachers who are in COVID era face-to-face, virtual, or hybrids, is it possible to do each of these 4 approaches in all those different environments? And the answer is yes. After we talk about the advantages, we say, are those advantages still possible in virtual, face-to-face, or hybrid? And the answer is yes. Are the cautions the same? And the answer is yes. There are nuances, little bits of differences, but you still can do all 4 approaches, regardless if it is virtual, face-to-face, or hybrid. And you can realize the advantages, and you need to be aware of the cautions. Let's look at that first approach, supportive co-teaching. In supportive co-teaching, one person is taking a lead role to teach the large group, while the other person or persons who are co-teaching are out and about among the students. There is a time and a place for this. There's a time and a place, as I said, for all of them. Many co-teaching teams begin with supportive, especially when they're getting to know one another, the children, the curriculum, the routines. And who leads and who supports does not need to be static. You can begin to switch on off and on those roles. There are clearly advantages. It will allow some students to get immediate support academically or maybe even behaviorally. When you have little to no planning time, you end up doing this. Or if you have it but do not hold it sacred, sometimes there's not much more you can do than supportive. The person who is out and about sees things that is not readily available to a person doing large group instruction. There are students who do not want to ask questions in front of the large group. Now, here's something in the virtual world. We've heard numerous times that students, particularly middle and high school age students, are comfortable texting or messaging one of the co-teachers who's not in lead, saying, I don't understand this. And then they pull them briefly into a little breakout room, explain it, and they re-enter. What the students are telling us when we interview them is that no one knows that they've left. So there's no stigma associated with asking for the support that you need. The person who's in the supportive role can also monitor, collect data, right? Again, they can feed back information to the teacher in lead. So lots of potential advantages. The cautions associated with it are that you must avoid at all costs Velcroing an adult to an individual student, having them function as if they're a hovercraft vehicle around that student. Interviewing typical students, we are often told if an adult is Velcroed to a child, it becomes a barrier to their desire to interact with that child. And besides, the definition says shared responsibility for all. We sadly can tell you we have seen scenarios where the classroom teacher doesn't interact with some children. They belong to the interventionist, they belong to the paraeducator. That's not inclusion, that's still stigmatization. Beware of putting one person in that supportive role all the time, making them, say, the discipline police, if you will, especially if you have two professionals. If you put someone in that supportive role, you will not be utilizing their skill set. If you look at research that is critical of co-teaching, saying, well, there's really not much of an effect size, read the description of what they're doing. They're doing supportive co-teaching. There is a time and a place for it, but it needs to become the least utilized of the four approaches.
Thank you, Rich. Well described. So let's take a look at the second approach, parallel co-teaching. Parallel co-teaching is when two or more people work with different groups of students. The instructors or the students may rotate, and there may be groups that work independently without an instructor. This is the only co-teaching approach of the four that is not whole group. I want to repeat that again. This is the only co-teaching approach that is not whole group. Unlike supportive co-teaching, where one teaches and the others support, now all personnel are instructing, so the skills of all personnel are being used. The great thing about parallel co-teaching is that there are so many grouping options. You can have centers and stations. Co-teachers can monitor different cooperative or lab groups, and you can group and instruct based upon students' learning preferences or need for supplemental or, let's say, extension experiences. Benefits. There are many benefits of parallel co-teaching arrangements. It's easy to differentiate instruction between groups because each co-teacher is teaching or monitoring a subset of the class. That student-teacher ratio is reduced, allowing each co-teacher to more closely monitor, collect data, and provide immediate and specific individualized student feedback. In small groups, students have greater talk time and greater opportunity to practice using academic language and use those small group interpersonal social skills that is so important at this time when we're thinking about social emotional learning. Also, because all personnel now are instructed, students are more likely to view all of their co-teachers as their real teachers. Cautions. One caution, let's go to the next slide for our visual support. One caution in brick and mortar classrooms is to beware of that elevated noise level when you have multiple activities going on. So be sure to situate groups around the room and teach, and expect students to use those indoor 12-inch small group voices. A second caution that's not on here, but we think you will want to add, is to that caution of avoiding over-monitoring or under-monitoring lab groups and cooperative groups. And you can do this by deliberately planning who will monitor which group during which part of an activity. A third caution, which is on this slide, is beware of failing to prepare your other co-teachers so they're able to deliver instruction to their groups as intended with integrity. You know, you're busy teaching, all of you, so you can't easily monitor one another's instruction. So this requires more trust, more communication, more planning. And then that top one big caution has to do with homogeneous grouping. Do we ever homogeneously group? Certainly, when we engage in targeted, differentiated concept and skill building. However, for the vast majority of the day, we want to heterogeneously group students along all those dimensions of diversity: gender, perceived ability or performance, cultural and linguistic background, strengths, interests, language. We want to do that so that we don't get that bluebird versus crow stigmatization. And you know, kids know, and teachers can get stigmatized too. If one co-teacher, Rich, for example, only works with high-performing, low-performing, any one set of students, the rest of the students won't view Rich as their real teacher. Now, this caution about over-reliance on homogeneous grouping versus fluid, flexible, and data-based grouping is particularly important for online co-teachers. We certainly don't want to inadvertently create a special class within a class by having, for example, an intervention teacher or paraeducator teach only students who are eligible for support services. What about complementary?
Complementary. So complementary co-teaching brings us back to large group instruction. And if you go in, it's kind of clear to you that one member of this co-teaching team is driving the content, but what the other member does is to increase the likelihood students will be able to access and be successful. So if I were co-teaching with someone, and not Jackie, but someone maybe not as facile with the information, and they said, what is the major objective for this portion? And we said, knowledge of similarities, differences, advantages, and cautions. And they developed that blank graphic organizer. And then while I am teaching, they model filling it in. The development, explaining it to the students, modeling how to fill it in is complementary behavior. There are so many different examples of things that can facilitate access. Visuals, right? Different examples, analogies, pre-teaching, vocabulary, idioms, figurative language for a word wall, developing sentence frames, anchor charts, anything that is going to facilitate access. So who is leading and who is complementing can also switch over time. And it should be something that you are planning to do. Your complementary partner is using their skill set. That is a very strong advantage here. And the students are obviously going to benefit from the content mastery and the access mastery. There are cautions associated with complementary co-teaching. And one of them is all of a sudden now we're both teaching the whole class. We have to make sure we do not forget to monitor the students. So think about the physical positioning of where you are in the classroom. Beware of too much teacher talk. In general, in our classrooms, there is too much teaching talk. We know whoever does the talking does the learning, whoever does the talking makes connection. We want the students to do the talking, the learning, and the connecting. Beware of stepping on each other's toes. So we'll often say to people, if you've not yet done complementary, then you need to be planning for when within this lesson would it make sense for something complementary to be done. And so when it happens initially, I'm not kind of surprised or startled. You're never going to script every moment, but we begin to get used to that other voice. And oftentimes we can just periodically pause, turn to our colleague and say, Jackie, is there anything else you'd like to add there?
Which brings us to team co-teaching. Team co-teaching is where two or more people do what one person otherwise would have done alone, and doing it better because two heads are better than one. In team co-teachers, partners distribute their responsibilities equitably. So co-teachers may be doing different things in their planning or their teaching or assessment, but it feels fair. And there are symbols of equity. Papers and notes go home with both names on them. And if you're in brick and mortar classrooms, both names are on the door and there are two big people desks. As with complementary co-teaching, team co-teaching, again, provides instruction to the whole class. However, in team co-teaching, you cannot tell who is in what official role, who's the content teacher, who's the interventionist, who's the paraeducator. Benefits, they're the same as complementary co-teaching. All teachers get to use their skill sets. Students view all co-teachers as real teachers and as equal. And because co-teachers both provide content instruction and provide access through differentiation, there are two additional benefits. The interventionists gain content masteries with a built-in content coach. And the content masters develop access skills with a built-in access coach. Partners can grow in their knowledge and skill as they each try on each other's roles and release their expertise to one another. Cautions with team co-teaching, again, they're the same as complementary. We must not forget to monitor. We must guard against too much teacher talk, and we must be mindful of not stepping on one another's toes.
So an example of team could be that if Jackie and I wanted you to get into a partner activity, we role play it as if we are those students. We'd be exactly equal. Another would be if there was a problem and then we're sharing, we're metacogniting, thinking about how we would approach it and having this conversation. We would be exactly equal and you could not discern who had what role, as Jackie was saying. So co-teaching is a legally available supplemental support aid and service that can be brought into a gen ed classroom to support English learners, children with disabilities, students who are duly identified, so they do not need to go to a more restrictive environment. It prevents us from doing, quote, dump and hope, because we are bringing support for It says I'm talking. I got a note that I was muted. Now my wife will mute me sometimes. But okay. So we often train people to become trainers in co-teaching. And related to the content that we've just shared, we have included another resource for you. So that's on pages 17 through 20. So if someone is going to work with us and train people in co-teaching, we observe them doing training. And then we look for the content. Are they hitting the major content? So this is just another representation of the unique features, advantages, and cautions but it also has some of the more frequently asked questions about co-teaching and what the answers are. And you may find this of value in your next step planning.
Aha. Are there challenges in achieving meaningful and successful collaboration in planning and teaching? Yeah, well, of course. There are challenges whenever we are implementing a new innovation. The good news is that educators just like you have invented and used tools that are effective in managing the expected challenges of collaborating and teaching with another human being. So you don't have to invent these, they already exist. So let's examine some and see what you might want to include in your own co-teaching and your own coaching toolbox.
So there are 7 tools that we are going to share with you. And as you can see, they begin on page 8 and they go to page 16. So we also want you to be thinking about how could you use these? How could the people that you coach and or support use them? So how could they be used, by whom, when? Now, following our review of these tools, we are going to put you into a breakout session. And in that breakout session, we want you to share with each other what were some of your thoughts and some of your answers related to with whom could we share this tool, how might we use it ourselves or support co-teachers to use it? When do we think it would be a good time for them or us to use this? We want to have you also identify when you come back, which of these tools like really stuck out for you, resonates with you, that you like. Okay, so we'll first review the tools, then you'll have a chance to go into breakout, and then you'll come back and let us know which tools stood out for you.
So we used a marriage or committed partnership analogy in our first training. So just like in a marriage or any committed partnership, we know that future co-teachers the partnerships are likely to be more successful if they have certain, if you will, prenuptial conversations. So we offer you the prenuptial conversation tool on page 8. And you see here and on that page, the topics that veteran teachers say co-teachers need to discuss for a smooth transition into a new marriage, if you will. So if co-teachers have the luxury, have the conversation before they start co-teaching, this is fabulous. And if co-teachers are in partnerships where they have not had these conversations, perhaps these conversations are even more important to have as soon as possible. You'll see on page 9 of your handout some sample conversations about strengths, fears, ground rules, and more. And on page 10, you see questions that veteran teams have identified as important questions to pose for each of these 7 topics that are on the left-hand side of your page. Of course, it's best if you and your co-teacher identify your own questions that you want to bring to the table for that prenuptial conversation, because your discussion and your answers to your questions are going to be the most relevant in terms of having a meaningful dialogue and agreement.
Okay, so after you've had that prenuptial conversation, it's time to develop your nuptial agreement. So on page 11, you have the nuptial agreement or the co-teaching role and responsibility matrix. So the way this works is that the co-teachers come together and say, okay, what are the responsibilities that need to be met for this group of children that we share? We're giving you a sample listing here. Of course, you could modify that. So we want them to come to an agreement together as to what are the responsibilities. And then we want them to go away from one another. Now, they have to put the names at the top. And of course, we have 4, but more often than not, it's just 2, but just in case, we want to leave a space for everybody. So develop the list of responsibilities together, go away from one another, use the code there at the top of the page. Who has primary responsibility, secondary, equal, or input? And sometimes if we're working with paraeducators and or Students as co-teachers, we may add NA for not applicable. So you code it individually, then you come back together and share. Do you want to find out if you're on the same page? Do you want to find out maybe you need a marriage counselor, a coach, if you will, to help facilitate the conversations? The sooner we have this, the healthier our team can function. Another tool for you is on page 12, teacher actions during co-teaching. Or sometimes it's called that if one of you is doing this, the other can be doing. This was developed by our colleague, Wendy Moravsky, and we share it with her permission. And it's just a sample. You know, it's great starter dough for new co-teaching teams, teams with para-educators, and do not be limited to what's on here. You certainly can add more things. So if you look at the last column, it's asking you to identify, is this an example of supportive, parallel, complementary, or team co-teaching? You will note that some of these items relate to our roles in teaching. We can be in supportive, parallel, complementary, or team. And some of these relate to our roles in planning. We can also be in supportive, parallel, complementary, and team mode when we're doing the planning. So take the first one. One of you is lecturing, the other could model note-taking. That would be an example of, in your chat box, is that an example of support, parallel, complementary, or team? Use the first letter, S for supportive, P for parallel, C for complementary, T for team. And it's not a waterfall chat. You can just type that letter when your heart desires. Okay, the vast majority of you said complementary, yes, because one is lecturing the whole class, but the other models that note-taking, that's facilitating access. For optional home fun, extension, and enrichment, finish the rest of this. Notice it's home fun, not homework.
Right, language matters. On page 13, we offer you the co-teaching tracking matrix. You see the co-teaching approaches across the top and the days of the week along the left-hand side. Now, this tool can be used in two different ways. At the end of the week, co-teachers can reflect on the approaches that they actually used. And they might notice that they have a nice mix of all four approaches, and they may celebrate, how facile they've come into using all four. Or they might notice that they've fallen into a pattern of only using one approach, such as supportive. And this will signal that they really need to be more planful in using more impactful approaches and changing it up. The matrix also can be used as a general planning tool for the week, where co-teachers lay out which approaches they definitely want to use on the various days. This is the Are We Really Co-Teachers self-assessment, and you'll find this on page 14. You'll notice that there's a 5-point Likert scale that has co-teachers self-assess in terms of whether they never, rarely, sometimes, usually, or always do each of these practices. We suggest that co-teachers work together for a while, a month, 6 weeks, so they have some data so they can actually answer these questions. And then they can either answer these items separately and come together and compare them, or they can do it together. In either case, they will notice where their strengths are, where they may have 4s and 5s, and they'll see some areas where they may have some areas for improvement, and they can use that as an opportunity to goal set. So it can be used to celebrate, goal set. And then we suggest revisiting this tool at least 3 times a year, because as a relationship, a new relationship moves along over time, the answers to these questions change. So you have an additional opportunity to celebrate and to goal set to become even better at your co-teaching practices. The last two tools are really around planning. And this right here is the co-teaching planning graphic organizer, and you'll find this on page 15. And this tool acknowledges what Rich and I have noticed about how co-teachers tend to plan. they tend to plan in time blocks. And so this is organized in those time blocks. So in column 1, co-teachers first discuss what they will teach in a block and how they plan to teach it. Prompts there in the second column have co-teachers ask one another, what are differentiated instructional needs of our students? What learning differences do our students have? And then columns 3 through 5 have the co-teachers consider which of the co-teaching approaches best supports their differentiated instruction of the students in each block and what exactly each of the co-teachers will be doing in their respective roles, such as if one person is doing that, the other person will be doing this. And then we also have on page 16 this lesson plan format, which adds into the previous format the essential elements of instruction for those of you who plan this way. So co-teachers can use this format to plan who will do what to execute the anticipatory set, their direct instruction, their guided practice and closure, and also what their roles will be in setting up independent practice.
So that was very quick overview of those. So we're going to give you a minute to just kind of flip through them. And then, as I said, we are going to put you into breakout session. But first, we want you to just, starting with page 8, take a minute or two to look at these. Be thinking about when you could use it, or the people that you will support could use it. How could they use it? How often, if you will, right? So who will use it? When will they use it? How will they use it? And which ones really stand out for you? Give you another 30 seconds or so here. So in a couple of seconds, we're going to put you into a breakout. You'll be in groups of around 4 or 5. We would ask that you turn your video on and that you unmute so that you can chat with one another. If you want to briefly introduce yourself, your name, where you work, your role, that's fine, but please not your whole life story. And then you'll have 10 minutes. So within that 10 minutes, talk about the tools. With whom could you use this with or encourage other people to use it? How might you or the co-teachers that you coach or hope to coach use it? When do you think that you would use it? What resonates, stands out for you? Have you used any of these tools? Are you aware of other tools and resources? Make that part of your conversation. When you come back in 10 minutes, then we're going to give you a poll to find out which one stood out for you. Okay. And then we'll open all the rooms. Have fun, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
I really was thinking, just as a SELPA, how I'd like to reuse these tools with our SELPA directors. I saw one with my I'm sorry, with my district directors. I saw one of my district directors pop in. I don't know, maybe something came up and he had to pop out. But I thought how this might be a supportive role of some of the specialists in my office to give them support, because some of them have, you know, TOSAs or other academic coaches.
Mm-hmm.
But if they would use a tool like this or this same tool to bring together their special ed teachers and their general ed teachers, uh, even as they think about, because some are piloting co-teaching, right? I can't say it's full spread district wide. It's at certain sites or between certain teachers at certain sites. But if they want to go that next deeper level,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really going to push these tools.
Yay.
Good.
Thank you.
I think you'll like the instructional observation
Yeah.
form and the coaching process format when we get to that as well.
And I liked how you said, it just resonated with me about, you know, sometimes in a perfect world, teachers are a match and it's an easy marriage, and some want to get divorced even before they get started
Mm-hmm.
because they're being voluntold, right, to be in this partnership. But having that survey where they rate themselves together, and I think how you said it was, you know, so that they can then plan forward, it is really where we are. Where, you know, I'm sorry, friends, this is kind of where we are. You know, maybe this quiz can help us come together and have a little meeting of the minds and move forward, right? We can only get better. We can only support each other.
We had a project in the state of Kansas. It's still ongoing. It's been going on about 7 years, federally funded. And we do all kinds of surveys and assessments. And one year every year there's an end of year survey for the co-teachers. And we're in like 115 school districts now. And one year though, that stands out for me is we had them identify if they were in a marriage of choice, or was it a marriage that was set up for them, right? And it really came out to be pretty much 50-50. Almost half of them were in marriages of choices, while the other half were in arranged marriages. And yet when we looked at their feedback, there was no statistically significant differences between them. They were all very positive, but they had received the training, they had received the coaching, they were being encouraged to use these kinds of tools. And sometimes I think we get our best marriages with the people who, you know, like chooses like. If you get people who have different ideas, perspectives. And we know the majority of teachers do not support a major innovation until after they've had a positive experience with the practice. Well, training, performance-based feedback, tools, these are the kinds of things that help them, right? As well as the logistics, making sure they have the planning time.
That's that right there, I think, is the biggest barrier that we're still trying to break down, is that protected time.
Yeah.
Because I still hear some say, well, if the teacher chooses, you know, we'll pay them on a separate timesheet after work hours, or, you know, during their prep when they're writing their IEPs and doing all this other stuff. So that, I think, then isn't necessarily supportive practice for the teachers, as opposed to if you said, this is protected time, I'm giving it to you, regardless if you take advantage, but it's right here and it's embedded supportive time, then teachers are more willing to say, okay, you know, I don't have to give up my prep, or I don't have to give up time outside of my work day, but that it's scheduled for me.
We would go maybe even just a little bit further from that, because if you give them the time, some people will use it and some won't. It's very obvious for us when we're observing these people have engaged in planning. I mean, the ones who engage in the planning are the ones that are going to get into the differentiation. What are the scaffolds? What are the supports? If you are flying by the seat of your pants, that simply doesn't happen. We're fond of a saying, we know it's respected by what is expected, supported, and inspected. So it's a condition of employment. you are, you plan to do the things that you need to be doing for students. So we encourage administrators and coaches to drop in on the planning.
That's great. I really think that
The-
helping me to reflect on next steps.
It's a journey. It is a journey.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'll mute myself. I'll let you all take a break.
All right, we're gonna about 4 more minutes and we'll pull them back. Okay.
All right. Well, we hope you had a nice conversation and met some new people. And we had you break out so that you would be prepared for a poll. So we in a second, we're going to launch a poll. This is going to be a multiple choice poll. And it will match the 7 tools that are on the left-hand side here. So as a multiple choice poll, feel free to vote for as many as you like. And the question is, which of the tools did you identify as valuable for your own collaborative planning and co-teaching and or in the coaching of co-teachers? And launch. Here we go.
As we're waiting for the polls to complete, question in the chat box, co-teaching in the virtual world, how can we support our teachers? How do we co-teach online?
Okay. Well, we support our co-teachers by making sure that they have training, that they are knowledgeable as to the 4 approaches. We have literally since March been working with people who are co-teaching online all the time or part of the time, as well as some people are in the COVID era face-to-face. All 4 approaches are being used virtually. It requires planning. It requires thought. You can attain the benefits that we mentioned, as well as you still need to attend to the cautions. We literally have asked hundreds of people co-teaching virtually, can you do these 4 approaches? Yes. Are the benefits the same? Are the cautions the same? Yes, there's a little bit of tweaking, but it really comes down to planning and to creativity. And I think we'll call the poll.
Okay, all right. So it looks like each one of these tools is valuable to some partnership or in your coaching role. It looks like the nuptial agreement and
the role and responsibility matrix.
Yes, clarifying responsibilities clearly is a really important thing that needs to occur early on. So thank you. And we hope that you certainly will share these tools and use these tools yourself. So the first 5 of these tools, the last 2, are planning templates. We want to remind you that these are ones that co-teachers can and should revisit throughout their partnership, because co-teaching answers will change as the year goes along. And frankly, sometimes we just forget our co-teaching agreements, and revisiting the tools help us to get back on track.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of that question about support, it's the same in terms of training. We also continue to observe people virtually co-teaching. Some people, have different capacities, the way that they're going to be able to film and share what they're doing. Sometimes it's synchronous, sometimes it's asynchronous, that they're going to send us, like maybe from a swivel, the robot, a video of their co-teaching. But then we will take them through the same debrief coaching process that we're going to model and share with you today. So that is an important piece. Remember, that's implementation science, the performance-based feedback. Something we also want to emphasize about the 4 approaches to co-teaching. In an observation of over 700 classrooms in the state of Kansas, K-12, we observed, but we were looking for which approaches to co-teaching they were using, but we were also looking for, were they implementing processes, practices that increase student engagement? Were they doing student-centered learning practices, right? And let's say the use of positive behavior supports, the clarification of an objective and making sure students knew it, right, in terms of what it was. So when we were looking at all these student-centered practices, we found that the more approaches to co-teaching used in a single period, the greater the use of student-centered practices. Can't tell you exactly why we found that, but it was true regardless of which student-centered practice we looked at. It increased the more co-teaching approaches used in that single period of time. Our hypothesis is it's because they were planning. When does it make sense to do supportive, to do parallel, to do complement, to do team? And in that planning, they were saying, oh, here would be a good time for us to give specific knowledge of feedback, provide cues, provide prompts, etc. So there was a question. A couple of you wanted the wording. It's in the chat box at 2:02.
That was a direct message.
Oh, okay.
Whoever does the talking does the learning. Whoever does the talking makes connections. And we'll probably say that one more time as we're moving along. Okay, next slide. Rich, can you
Additional resource? Oh, yeah.
Can you
It's
lift this
it's a
up? It's a
very
very
big,
busy screen. It's so hard to find the arrow. There's the arrow. All righty. So thank you for asking about additional resources, because we already thought about that in terms of administrative action. You know, the tools remind us that co-teachers have responsibilities with one another and to their students, but so also does the system. Remember, as Rich said, with regard to implementation science tells us that the successful use of any educational best practice requires organizations to provide administrative support and infrastructure. And so on page 21, you'll find an additional resource of administrative actions for promoting co-teaching. So if you're an administrator, enjoy looking at this and seeing what you're doing and what else you might do. If you're a co-teacher, this is something that you could share with your administrators.
okay. So we know what an overwhelming time this is for people. Even before COVID, educators were frequently saying, oh my gosh, we have this initiative and this initiative. How do these initiatives come together? I mean, what is the overarching goal? What are we trying to achieve, right? So how do these various initiatives help us get there? How do they interrelate with one another? Well, we wanted to share with you a conceptual framework that we call the schoolhouse model. And you have this on page 22. And it takes 4 initiatives: inclusion, if you will, which is our top floor, access and success for all students, including our students who are duly identified, differentiating instruction, co-teaching, and data-based decision-making. You could look at the schoolhouse model and see it as part of a multi-tiered system of support. We know that the overarching goal is that top floor. We want our students to have access, but also be successful. And we're talking about all students. So how do you get there? Well, differentiated instruction, co-teaching, data-based decision-making are going to help us to get there. We also then realize that floors 2, 3, and 4 are dependent upon administrative leadership and support. So you'll notice that is the foundation of the schoolhouse model. That is the ability to articulate a vision. This is where we're going. To listen to concerns, to build support for it, to provide training, to provide coaching, performance-based feedback, logistics, scheduling, common planning, right? That being a cheerleader, if you will, for the initiative. We also realize that all of those initiatives are also dependent upon collaboration and planning and in problem solving, creativity. So the first floor has to be collaborative planning and problem solving. Yes, we need to give you tools. We need to give you, yes, we need to give you time to collaboratively plan and problem solve, but we also need to give you tools so that you can be efficient. If we have that administrative leadership and support, we're engaged in collaborative planning and problem solving, we move up to that second floor. Co-teaching can occur through tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Certainly in tier 1 core instruction, we can strengthen it by having co-teachers. I saw earlier in the chat box, somebody said, would it make sense to sometimes have 2 content area teachers coach together? Yes, if they also have access skills. Simply placing a child with a master of content is not a guarantee that they're going to be successful. If it was, they wouldn't have necessarily been referred for all those other support programs. We've worked with places where they've provided training. They've initially paired access experts, interventionists with content teachers, and then eventually moved the access experts into other curricular areas. I'm thinking of a school that we worked with in Pennsylvania, middle school. After 2 years of training and co-teaching content masters and access masters, they moved the access masters away from the math and language arts teachers, have them work in science and social studies. And they created this ingenious way of bringing at least 1 block a day, the 2 math teachers together and 2 language arts teachers. So everybody who was in the math department had at least 1 co-taught class where someone came into their room and they at another block went into someone else's room. It was a very ingenious kind of schedule. Certainly co-teaching would occur in tier 2, supplemental in tier 3, intensive support as well. If we have the administrative support, the collaborative planning, the problem solving, we are using the data that we gather, allocating our resources across tier 1, 2, and 3 with the data we have collected and the increasing the ratio of instructional personnel to children, we are better able to differentiate instruction. And in so doing, we reach that top floor.
Now, Rich mentioned one of the administrative supports is making sure that we structure time into our schedule. So as an additional resource, we have for you on page 23, this time for planning menu. We actually have worked over decades with schools and gathered ways in which they've tried to expand their time. So here's some ways in which people have borrowed time, expanded time, freed up time, purchased time, discover time for collaborative planning. So take a look at this list. We're not prescribing these, or these are idea starters, some food for thought, because we know that we won't get past, as Rich said, supportive co-teaching unless we actually have the opportunity to have shared planning time.
Okay. So let us now move into instructional observation and coaching. And this is where you're going to be using your highlighters, whether you're using it on your device or you've downloaded this. So this is an instructional observation form. It is on page 24 and 25. It is imperative that you understand that this is not about evaluation. This is not about good teacher, bad teacher. All it is a way to capture what you see in the window of time when you're observing. We typically observe our co-teachers for 20 to 40 minutes. We suggest never less than 20. And if I were going in to observe a teacher who wasn't even co-teaching, I would use this. If I were going in to look at co-teachers, I would do this. A check is not good or bad. It just means present or absent in that window. And one of the most valuable things about this tool is if you use it, you will always be able to identify things that you can comment. So let's just briefly look at it. And then we're going to look at the research that informs the content of it. And that's when you'll be using highlighters. So the first box at the top is just basically the demographic information. And then you move into content and materials. Are there multiple means of representation? What is our instructional objective? In schools where there are a lot of English learners, they also always have language objectives. Are the objectives referenced, posted, is a rationale provided or solicited from students? Do we have differentiated materials? Then you move to the product and assessment dimension. Multiple means of expression. Are the outcomes demonstrated? Are they demonstrated in multiple ways? Has the criteria for success been explained? Is it measured? And are the outcomes measured in a variety of ways? And then we begin to look at the processes of learning. And you'll notice on the bottom left, that's the first place you see co-teaching approaches. Which of any of the co-teaching approaches did you see? In terms of how students are accessing content or showing what they know, are there various learning styles or multiple intelligences being utilized? In terms of that discourse, the whoever's doing the talking part that we were referring to a little while ago, is it primarily teacher, equal teacher-student, or primarily student? The processes continue in the next page. Which learning arrangements are in place? Notice that we have partner, small group, and then you see in the far right, quick cooperative structures. So if we did something like a quick think, paired, share, that would be a quick cooperative structure, Kagan-esque, if you will. The next section is about directly related teacher and student behaviors. In your observation, you may see a teacher teach clear and evident academic and or behavioral procedures. You may not see that, but maybe simply by watching the students and seeing how they transition, how they participate in various activities like a literature circle, a cooperative learning group, et cetera, you know that they're following clear and evident academic behavioral procedures. So you may see it taught, you may see it followed, or one or the other. And everything in this section kind of takes us from the teacher behavior to the directly related student behavior, providing think time. For most questions, a minimum of 3 to 5 seconds. And did the students engage in it, et cetera. Use of academic language, calling on students who do not volunteer, and those students being able to respond correctly. If you move down to the next section, you have the additional teacher behaviors. They're not directly related to the student behaviors. For example, are they providing non-linguistic representation? Is there smooth transition between our co-teachers? And then we could look at some of the additional behaviors that we might see with our students. At the bottom, you have the cognitive levels, and there are 2 columns. We've got this in terms of this is what the teacher's initiating, and the student response was at what level, right? In terms of that student response. Sometimes their response may be at a higher or a lower level than what the teacher was hoping for. Student engagement. So in most classes, there'll be moments where you'll have the 0 to 29. You ask a question, if one student is answering it, you're in 0 to 29. But what's the highest level of engagement? And we're trying to get many, many students involved and engaged. And so sometimes we even on the outside put an average overall estimate. So you're going to get practice identifying research-based components that are on here and practice using it as we observe some co-teachers. And then we'll move into the coaching cycle with them.
On pages 26 through 23, we've created 26 to 30, excuse me. I'm not going, you can't go backwards, right? 26 to 23. From pages 26 through 30, we've provided you with a glossary of terms which define every single item on the observation form. And we do this because we want to make sure that we have a common conceptual framework, language, and understanding of what the items on the instruction observational form mean. So for home fun, we encourage you strongly to examine and study this glossary to make sure your definition of each item matches how it is actually used on the observation form. Giving you a lot of home fun. You're gonna have so much fun after this.
Right. So it is important because people use this terminology, but they mean very different things. So for example, student engagement, we were just talking about that. What is student engagement? For us, it has to be something that is observable, measurable. So it is a behavior and action that is observable, measurable, related to the learning target or objective, if you will. So one of the researchers who informs the content of that instructional observation form is Marzano. We think Marzano writes about a book a week. He does a great job of synthesizing research. Probably his most famous work was Classroom Instruction That Works, and that really was Marzano, Pollock, and Pickering. On page 31, you have the 9 research-based strategies that Marzano and colleagues, after doing a meta-analysis of all the research out there, saying which practices increase student achievement, they came up with 9. They did that meta-analysis in 2001. Interestingly enough, McCrell in 2011 did meta-analyses again. So he had all the old research, but he also had a decade more of research. The same 9 practices in the same order, same effect size appeared. So we know that these 9 research-based strategies increase student achievement. We want to share them with you, and this will be your first opportunity to use your highlighters when we're done. Can you find them on that observation tool? All 9 are highly correlated with increased student achievement, but as you go up that list and you get up to the top, there's greater correlation. Number 1 would be the most highly correlated. So starting at the bottom, number 9, questioning at all levels of Bloom's taxonomy, combined with the use of advanced organizers. So Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchy of thinking. It's a cognitive taxonomy. There are psychomotor and social taxonomies as well. His is probably the most famous. So let's look at this for a moment. Here we see the revised Bloom's taxonomy. It's revised because beginning in the 2000s, people switched the top 2 floors. So thinking that synthesis is a higher level of thinking than evaluation. So we begin at the bottom with knowledge. And so that is to know, to memorize, to list, to match, to restate. Comprehension is to demonstrate an understanding. So you're explaining it to me in your own words correctly. And then you move up to application, to apply, to use, to solve. Analysis level thinking is to compare and contrast, to categorize, to classify. Venn diagram is a good example. Evaluation level thinking means that we have to form an opinion, but we must also defend it, justify, debate, argue for it. Synthesis is to create, to imagine, to invent, to prescribe. Some people believe that there's a higher level of thinking above this, metacognition, and that is the thinking about your own thought processes. One of the best representations of the revised Bloom's taxonomy is called the nested Bloom's taxonomy. You can easily find this with a Google search. What's so great about it is you have the activities and the actions, right? The verbs over there on the right, and you have product objects over on the left. Notice that knowledge is remembering, comprehension, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating is synthesis. So we would encourage you to look at this and to think about what are you seeing when you're observing in a classroom. What we also find valuable with this is all students should be encouraged to use higher level thinking. A historical criticism of special ed and English learning programs is that it involves primarily lower level thinking, know, list, name, right? Comprehension, knowledge, some application, drill and kill. We want all students to engage in these different levels, but this will help us differentiate in analyzing, evaluating, creating what they do, what they produce. The use of this combines with advanced organizers. So in advance, it gives them a schema, a way to, they know what they're going to be learning and a way to organize that information.
Okay, number 9. Number 8, drum roll. Generating and testing hypotheses versus telling. Clearly, the curricular area that comes to mind with regard to testing hypothesis is science, the one that readily comes to mind. But we can ask students to generate and test hypotheses in any curriculum area. For example, we ask students to predict what comes next when reading a novel. In math, we ask students to predict by estimating. So generating and testing hypotheses. Number 7, Setting clear objectives, letting students know the objectives, and providing specific descriptive feedback along the way. Why? So that we achieve mastery learning rather than mystery learning. And objectives not only should be posted and referenced, but students should also be asked to self-assess their own progress toward the objectives, that student agency. And they also should be asked to provide their own evidence related to the criteria for success for mastery of those objectives. Number 6.
Number 6, one of our favorites,
Yes.
cooperative group, we'll go away. Cooperative group learning. Probably the most researched instructional strategy in the history of the world. We're aware of over 700 major studies, multiple countries with diverse groups of learners, comparing how well do students do if they learn cooperatively compared to learning individualistically or competitively. In cooperative group learning, we have increased retention, greater academic achievement, greater ability to understand and take another person's perspective. They have better attitude towards schools, towards teachers. They have access to psychological social support. They learn collaborative skills. Very powerful technology, but it doesn't happen by just simply putting students in a group. So as a little bit of a resource for you, if you go to page 35, you can see this little lecture guide related to the 5 critical elements of an effective cooperative learning group. If all 5 of these variables are present, you have a greater likelihood of those research outcomes I just shared. Now, as another resource for you, if you look at your handout, you will see that there's a website mentioned, ravillabayridge.com. It's on the cover. If you go to the website, there are a variety of topical areas. One is cooperative group learning. If you go to that, there is a very big handout on this formal cooperative group learning. Part of it is a guided lesson plan. If you follow that structured guide, it would be impossible to develop a lesson that didn't include all 5 of these elements. Let me briefly touch upon them. PIGS FACE is an acronym to help us remember them. The P in PIGS FACE is about positive interdependence, the essence of social interaction, all for one and one for all. There are at least 9 ways that teachers can structure positive interdependence. You don't have to do all 9, but the more that you do, the greater that sense of group cohesion, and I can't succeed if you don't succeed. Individual accountability, the I. The number one criticism we hear of cooperative group learning, one child did all the work, everyone put their name on it. That's not cooperative group learning. The teacher failed to assure the presence of individual accountability. All students must be held accountable. Most importantly, they must know in advance before you turn them loose, what will they be held accountable for, when will they be held accountable, and how. And you can differentiate in this. What, when, how. The G is about the group processing as a group. Every time they come together, they have an academic task and they have collaborative skills, social skills that they need to be working on. They need to process both the academic and the social skills. Frequently, we hear teachers tell students, get in group, be collaborative, take turns, share, you've got a role. But when they process, they just process the academics. Students learn that we do not really value those collaborative skills if that is what we're doing. We know what's respected by what is expected and inspected. Students will learn that you value those social skills, not only expecting them, teaching them, and monitoring them and having the students focus on it. They can go through 4 stages of group development where they can refine their social skills. There are sample social skill lesson plans available for you as lists of social skills and how to teach social skills in that handout on my website. And then you've got to make decisions about who's together face to face. 2 to 6, most teachers seem to prefer 3s and 4s. And for the most part, they need to be in heterogeneous mixed ability groups. The research says they do better in those groups. Don't let students most of the time choose who they work with because like chooses like, and you get better results with diversity.
Thank you, Rich. Marzano, number 5, the use of graphic organizers and other non-linguistic representations. Both are highly associated with student achievement because the vast majority of our learners today are visual learners. It's where they spend their time. Graphic organizers help students to organize information into conceptual frameworks, and non-linguistic representations enhance students' ability to use mental images to represent and elaborate upon their knowledge. Number 4, in-class, virtual and live, modeling and guided practice with homework at the appropriate level of difficulty. And we would call it home fun, of course. Emphasized here is that homework is not assigned until students have had adequate modeling and guided practice, so you are confident they are able to be successful in that independent practice. Remember, practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So if you send learners home to practice imperfectly, you'll firm up error and decrease motivation. Clearly, homework can and should be, therefore, differentiated across students. You know, many teachers have moved to flipped classrooms, so students are introduced to content at home, typically through that use of technology, and then work through the content with guided practice and modeling in school so that we are sure that practice is perfect. Number 3. Attribution theory tells us what we attribute student success to is very important. Therefore, we need to reinforce effort as well as successive approximations in addition to the desired outcome, the product. By reinforcing effort, we keep students motivated, particularly when we're asking them to engage in rigorous tasks that may be difficult for them. Interestingly, in 2017, McCluskey and colleagues actually researched and identified and summarized the top high leverage practices in special education. And the use of strategies that promote active student engagement, like reinforcing effort, rose to the top. So it's an outcome not only in general, but also in special education. Number 2, summarizing and note-taking are 2 ways that promote active engagement. First, we teach and model for students how to note-take and otherwise summarize their learning. We then pause regularly so students have frequent opportunities to reflect and engage with others, with their peers, verbally and in writing. As a resource, therefore, on pages 36 and 37, we offer you 12 quick cooperative learning structures. Rich talked about cooperative learning as that number 6 Marzano best practice. Well, on those pages, you'll find some quick structures that you can drop into any lesson, any experience. So students interact with one another and summarize their learning with their peers. And there's one left.
There is, number 1. The most highly correlated with increased student achievement is students being able to identify similarities and differences, compare, contrast, categorize, classify, Venn diagram, a perfect example here. Why? Transfer theory tells us the greatest predictor of student academic success is the ability to transfer prior knowledge into a new learning situation. If you can firm up what things are as well as what they are not, people are going to be more likely to transfer that into the next learning situation or environment. So that's a lot of information, but it is our attempt to get you familiar with the content of the instructional observation form prior to asking you to use it as we look at some co-teachers. So here's your first opportunity to use highlighters. So you have the instructional observation form and you have the Marzano, right? 9 practices. Notice that the copy you have, we also ask people to do a bit of a self-assessment of your comfort level with this knowledge and practice, and which ones maybe do you want to learn a little bit more about. So we are going to ask you to go through the observation form and highlight any of the 9 Marzano practices that you can see there. So remember, it is on pages, we want you to use the one that's on 38, and I believe 38 and 39. Yes, so pages 38 and 39. You should create a colored key. So we're going to look at Marzano's research. We're also going to look at some other research, so you'll be able to remember where it came from. We chose yellow when we were doing this particular one. So the way we're going to work this is that we're going to give you, let's see what time we have, 2:40. We're going to give you 10 minutes. Will not take you 10 minutes to do this. The first time we're going to ask you to do it individually, okay? So pick your color, note on page 38, if it's yellow or whatever color, write Marzano so you remember where it came from. Go through this tool, highlight in that color with your technology or an actual highlighter if you've downloaded it. And then we will come back in 10 minutes, all right? Thank you. 10 minutes. Should take you maybe 3 or 4 minutes to do this. Don't sit there, get up, move around a little bit, take care of yourself. Okay, 2:41. We'll see you at 2:51. Okay, folks, we are going to get started. And hopefully you were able to see some items on the form. And again, we want you to become familiar with the items on the form before we ask you to use it, and to also understand what research informs the items. Somebody had asked for the website. So at 2:42, you see in the chat box, our website that we use is ravillabayridge.com. That also appears on the cover of your handout. Excuse me, and you are welcome to take, use, copy, share any of the materials related to any of the topics that are there. All right, so when we did it, as I said, we used yellow, and there are some of the items that we felt clearly were there because they represent the findings of Marzano, Pollack, and Pickering, the 9 practices most highly correlated with increasing student achievement.
So we're going to take a look at the work of another group of researchers and begin by having you predict what you think is happening in schools in the US these days. What does a snapshot of our schools and classrooms look like across this country? So at this point, we're moving to page 32. So if you could turn to the page that looks like this, and you'll see a list. So in this list, this is out of Doug Reeves and colleagues' research study that was entitled 24/7, hence the title on the top of the page. And Doug Reeves and colleagues observed in 1,500 K-12 classrooms all across the nation. And they were looking for evidence of the presence of each of these 14 instructional practices listed in the first column. So right now, we want to draw your attention to the second column that's entitled Your Prediction. We'd like you to take a moment to predict, hypothesize, oh, Marzano's practice number 7, hypothesizing rather than telling. So we'd like you to take a moment and predict what you think they observed in those 1,500 classrooms. What did they see with regard to each practice? For example, practice number 1, clear learning objectives. In what percentage of the 1,500 classrooms did they find evidence of clear learning objectives? So you would put your prediction in terms of a percentage of classrooms in that second column, directly to the right of clear objectives. We'll give you all the time you need, about 2 minutes, to make your predictions, and then we'll share with you the data. So, page 32, percentages for the 14 practices. Okay, if you could finish up your predictions. We'll bring us back together in a second. Okay, thank you. So I want to call your attention to the 13th item. There's actually a missing number there. It should say fewer than half of students engaged. So if you could put fewer than half and make your prediction for that. In what classrooms did they observe fewer than half of the students engaged? Okay. Later, as home fun, you could come back and complete the third column, thinking about your own school and your own school district. But for now, let's examine what they found. So let's start at the top. With regard to clear learning objectives, they found that out of these 1,500 K-12 classrooms, clear learning objectives were detected in only 4% of the classrooms. How does that match with yours? Next one. Evidence of teaching to mastery. Percentage? 0. We speculate that this may be a result of that pressure that many of us are feeling with regard to covering the curriculum. Percentage of classrooms where there's evidence of higher order thinking, such as Rich reviewed the revised Bloom taxonomy, where we're talking about analysis, synthesis, metacognition, evaluation. Evidence of that, 3%. And what percentage of classrooms did they observe teachers using worksheets? Over half. Evidence of students writing, editing, using rubrics to do that. At the time that this occurred, they didn't see it in any classroom. Today, in the classrooms I know Rich and I have observed, we do see students writing, editing, and using those rubrics. What about the percentage of time that students were engaged in non-instructional activities and behaviors unrelated to the stated objective? Okay. You saw over a third of the classrooms, students engaged in activities not related to the objective. The use of academic dialogue and discussion. We saw that in, don't miss that decimal point, in 1 out of 200 classrooms, the observers saw students actively engaged in dialogue and discussion. Lecture. Observers saw teachers lecturing in just under a third of the classrooms. Note that these are K-12 results. If you look at just secondary classrooms, research shows that on the average, 80% of classroom time is devoted to teacher lecturing. So in far too many classrooms, there is far too much teacher talk. This is something co-teachers must be particularly aware of, because whoever is doing the talking is doing the learning, whoever is doing the talking is making connections. Monitoring students, but without feedback, with limited feedback, 22%. Now, what this means is that 78% of the classroom students were being monitored and were receiving formative feedback, and this is good news. Students required to speak in complete sentences. This was observed in none of the classrooms. If students do not complete sentences, they often fail to use that academic language that we want them to learn and use. For example, if I ask students, what is the denominator in the fraction 1/4? They answer 4. rather than using the academic language, in this case, denominator. The denominator of the fraction 1/4 is 4 in a complete sentence. How important is it for our English learners to speak and use complete sentences? Evidence of assessment for learning to inform instruction, formative assessment. 0. Seen a pattern. Evidence of bell-to-bell instruction. Here's that half one. Sorry about that on your worksheet. In what percentage of classrooms did we see fewer than half of the students engaged? Or said otherwise, more than half unengaged? 82%. And what about those high yield instructional strategies like Marzano's? In what percentage of the classroom did we see this? Notice that decimal point again? So 0.2%. In 3 out of those 1,500 classrooms, observers saw those Marzano and other high yield skills being used. So given the items, again, we're going back to these pages that you highlighted already. Given this Reeves information, we now ask you to go back to the form and examine it to detect any of the 14 Reeves items. Use a different color, if you would, to highlight those items, either with manually or with your computer.
We chose green.
You're going to see green. Yeah, we chose green. Don't forget to include on your legend which color you identified as the Reeves 24/7 items.
This time, though, as you do it, we're going to give you an opportunity to chat with some other people. So we are going to put you into a breakout. And we'll make the breakout rooms even a little bit smaller. So let's see.
Dr. Villa, while you're taking care of that, there's a question in the chat box.
All right.
Question is, what's evidence bell-to-bell instruction and percentage?
Okay. So bell-to-bell instruction is that from the time that class, that period starts until it's over, we are instructing it. And it came, their research at the time said 0%. This is long, though, been held with research that we're giving this amount of time. How much of it is taken up with administrivia? How much of it is, not smooth transitions on the part of students? How much of it is really not that actual student engaged time? And that's been a historical criticism. We do know that, prior to COVID, I was in somewhere between 800 to 1,000 classrooms a year. Some of what Reeves and his colleagues said I would see sometimes. Some of it I would see very often, but a lot of what they found I see much better than, especially in co-taught classrooms. Okay, so we're going to recreate these groups. We're going to give you 5 minutes to introduce yourselves and just share which of the Reeves items do you see. And don't forget to go back to the legend, put the color and write Reeves. We will see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you for that time in the breakout rooms, taking a look at the Reeves items. What you see here are items highlighted in green that Rich and I located on the observation form pages. So if you would take a moment and see to what extent your highlighted items matched, and feel free to put whatever color you selected for these Reeves items. Again, we want to emphasize that this observation form is based on research data, so hence our activity with you. Welcome. I think almost everyone's back.
Okay, so now we have another question for you. And we're going to ask you to do another waterfall chat, if you will. So what makes a teacher effective? We want you to think back to when you were a student What made a teacher effective when you were the learner? Doesn't really matter what their name is, the grade level, the subject. What did they say? What did they do? What was the action? What made them an effective teacher? Now, if they are still alive, send them a thank you note. In the chat box, type, but don't hit return until we prompt you to do so. Think of an effective teacher that you had. What did they say? What did they do that made them effective? I'll give you another 5-10 seconds. What made a teacher effective for you? Okay, please hit that return key. Let's see what you said. And thank you for your participation.
Connection,
Constant check-ins,
enthusiasm,
connecting with the students and delivering their content. So the ability to connect students, their content mastery.
building relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Children will not care what we have to teach them until they know we care.
And then you've got the students mindful that they're in charge of their own learning, another relationship, behavior management.
Made me feel like I mattered.
Gave you time, positive, clever, inventive, collaborative opportunities for students.
Saw me as a unique person who they liked.
Mm-hmm.
More connections.
Classroom management, connections, again, relationship is big here.
Took the time to explain what I didn't understand and held me accountable nicely.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
There are lots of comments there. So when we think about effective instruction, Madeline Hunter is a name that was very, very well known in terms of looking at the research and synthesizing it. And she said that an effective teacher has to be skilled in 6 areas. And to remember that, I came up with an acronym, HICCUP. And the HICCUP is here. And most of these we believe that you touched upon in your What Made a Teacher Effective. So much of what you said was the H in HICCUP, human relations, skilled in those human relations, connection, caring, relating to the students. The pedagogy, the instruction, the science and the art, content mastery, right? And the instruction was the ability to deliver that content. Classroom management, you mentioned a lot of that. Use of materials, valued materials, hands-on, of course, in the world today, technology. I didn't see explicitly mentioning planning, but they didn't just show up. They were organized, they were planning. So she said at the time, an effective teacher needs to be skilled in these 6 areas, HICCUP. It's true then, it is still true today. I had the opportunity to spend a week with her as my teacher. And I was fascinated. She was 78 years old. She had 200 people, 8 to 4, 5 days in a row. She modeled every instructional practice she spoke about. She had complete instructional control. So we're going to ask you to think about these items as you look at that observation form. And also thinking about how important, she said, questioning for understanding was. So one of the things, of course, that she thinks about is think time, that making sure that we provide a minimum of 3 to 5 seconds. How long is 5 seconds? 5 seconds. That felt long now. It feels long. Let's say you're in front of a group of hormone raging middle school students, right? Here's a good place for co-teachers. One can ask the question, the other can monitor the think time, and then maybe call on the students. That'd be complementary. She's always saying that we ask the question And don't call on somebody like, Jackie, what is the 9 horizontal practices? Better to ask, be prepared to tell us what the 9 horizontal practices are if I call on you. Give the think time and then call on somebody. If you mention who's going to answer first, everybody else is off the hook. Sometimes withhold the response. Don't say yes, right, student answers. Well, who is the 17th president of the United States? You get an answer. Who's the 17th president of the United States? Who's the 17th president of the United States? Kids are thinking, now wait, did I get it right when I said Andrew Johnson? Or whenever we can, we need to provide opportunities for every learner to demonstrate they've got it. So we do our choral responses, written samples, use of whiteboards, clickers, signals, total physical response. It will not, and this one for us is critically important. Call upon learners who do not raise their hands. You may want to let them know in advance you're going to call on them. You might want to look and check that they've got a right answer or set them up for success. But every student needs to feel that they will be held accountable. You won't always be able to question everybody, but she used the term dipsticking, like you check the levels in a car. Well, check your various levels. Call on some of the students who always get it, students who are typical average, if you will, and students who struggle in learning, so you know how your different levels are doing. So we are going to give you an opportunity individually. I'll leave this up and I will go back here to start for a minute for hiccup, and then I'll go back to these to see if you can find anything. We're not going to do it in breakout. To see if you can find anything on the form. Oops, looks like we did. This time we chose, Jackie tells me it's teal blue for ours. So we're going to give you a couple minutes here to just look through there. Can you find any of the 100 essential elements of effective instruction, the components of that total teaching act, and in particular emphasis on the questioning? I'll switch to the questioning slide in about 15, 20 seconds. And we'll give you another 15, 20 seconds. And here with teal blue, you can see some of the items we thought clearly related to the 100 Total Teaching Act, elements of effective instruction, and those strategies for questioning, for understanding. All right.
One last opportunity that we're going to give you as home fun. You're all familiar with universal design, but there are different universal design for learning models. So on your page 34, you will find these 3 universal design models and the principles that are associated with each. So optional home fun, we encourage you to pick a 4th color and highlight on the instructional observation form the universal design principles and guidelines that are here and on that page, and that you find included on the form. So now we are ready to use this observation form.
You should be quite familiar with that form and its items. And remember, you also have that glossary that describes the terms. So, using the 2-page instructional observation form on pages 24 and 25, we're going to look at 2 video clips, and I'll pause a little between the first and the second and check off what you believe you are seeing. So I will stop sharing that one and switch. What will I now? All right. Okay, we are going to go to a 4th grade class. You are in Wheeling, Illinois, about 30 minutes from Chicago Airport. We are going to see Max, who is a learning coach, who is co-teaching with Megan, who's a 4th grade teacher. Using your observation form, what do you see? We'll look at this clip and then we'll move to another one.
So today we're going to take everything we've learned and apply the science concepts of survival to create a new organism.
So if you remember yesterday, we were kind of comparing the 2 animals and talking about which one would have a better adaptation for survival. So that's really what we're going to be targeting for today. You get to invent an organism. But the way that we're going to do that is we're going to sound like scientists today. And the way we're going to sound like scientists is that we are going to explain how external structures and adaptations help organisms to survive.
And today you're going to be working in groups and with your partner. So we want you to make sure that you're using your collaborative working skills. So you're going to be taking turns, sharing, and listening when you're either with your group or with your partner. Okay? Can we do that? Mm-hmm. Yes. Awesome.
You know what's coming. We're going to be doing our musical charades activity, where you'll have an opportunity to, again, act out using your TPR movement, the vocabulary word that you're holding, and then your partner will be guessing what that vocabulary word is and providing an explanation or a definition in their own words. You'll then compare their definition to the actual definition written down and confirm and clarify the actual definition.
So when you get your card, you're going to take a look at it, and then you can stand up. And if you need to, you can refer back to our bulletin board with our terms, and we will start moving once we hear the music. Okay, so find someone near you, match up.
The way a person or animal reacts to that is better. Forward. Want itself to blend it with one part.
And boom. All right, go ahead and switch cards.
Okay, time is up. If you can put the containers back in the center of your table. Mr. Ryder, I thought they did a really good job of managing the materials.
They were very respectful, boys and girls. I noticed that many of you, almost all of you, put the materials back after you were done looking at it, and that allowed someone else to be able to take it out and think about how they might use that for a structure as well. So very well done.
What senses were you using during this right now? Going back to our senses topic. Mia? Sight. And how are you using sight?
Looking at many different kinds.
Very good.
We'll kind of show you what this looks like then. So if we're sitting at a table together and we have the box in between us, right now, Ms. Clark maybe has just finished explaining how she might use one of these objects to represent a structure.
So what should I do with this? If I'm done, what do I do next? Call it out. I pass it, yeah, I'm gonna pass it to Mr. Ryder. You would pass it to the person sitting next to you, okay? And I can hold this to make sure that you're reading the sentence frame.
So when I was exploring silently, I was thinking about what these objects could represent on a real animal, an organism that I could create. And so if I just take one out, for example, I was thinking a little bit about this when, Joe, I saw you doing that same thing where you were holding one of these up and thinking about it. So right now I have the cotton ball. So I'll look at my frame because I need to communicate with my table partners. Okay, so this object can represent the external structure of, I was thinking fur. This structure can help an organism survive by, let's see, fur doesn't really help with movement, food, or maybe protection. So I was thinking that this structure can help the organism survive by providing a covering on its body. Maybe like a polar bear, it's in a cold environment, so that fur could protect the animal against the elements, the cold.
That's a really interesting idea. And then Mr. Ryder would put his material back in, and we would he would pass the Beanie Baby or the talking stick to the next person at the table. Does everyone have to
Most interesting that you would most like to use in constructing an organism, or something that gave you a really good idea?
And if your partner or your table mate is not using the sentence frame, what should we do? Or what should you do? Because we'll be watching and listening. Can you turn and tell your partner what you would do? Ready, set? Ms. Ryder, do you want to pick someone who can tell us if we forget to use this, what should we remind our group mates to do?
Well, Esther, I overheard you agreeing with Frank, and so what did you agree to? What did you agree about?
Okay, give you a second while I transition to the second clip to see if there's anything else you want to record there. Same lesson, a different point, and a different approach. That was predominantly team co-teaching. Okay.
We're going to set the timer for 2 minutes. So you have 2 minutes to explore on your own, okay? And that is going to start right now.
And moving forward, you will be kind of collecting ideas. So think about all the ideas that you'll be listening to right now. That's very important because you'll be taking those great ideas for the next activity, okay? So be really good listeners.
And before we start, if you get stuck and you're not sure like what external structure it could represent, we have our poster back there. So you can refer to our structures to help you if you need to. Okay? Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead and go.
When I have this when I was looking at this, I was thinking like about an eye because it was round, and I know that animals need eyes to see. So I was this object can represent the external structure of an eye. This structure can help the organism survive by food because the eye can help it find food.
Remind me, what structure did you say it would represent? The eye. Okay, so it would help protect, and how would it help it protect?
By looking and seeing predators.
Okay, interesting. Ready, set? Okay, boys and girls, if you can once again put the container in the center of your table. Okay, awesome. Ms. Ryder, I heard a lot of good conversations from the groups that I visited.
I did as well.
Right, and it looked like everyone was using the sentence frame too, and even if you started your sentence, you remembered, oh man, I gotta use that. So that was really great. Raise your hand if you heard a new idea that you hadn't thought of before from your group members. Okay, good, almost all of us. So now what we're going to do is we are going to put you in your animal groups so you can hear even more ideas from other people not at your tables.
So we're going to, in a moment, see their conference that followed that. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the conference procedure. So if in your handout, if you go to page 40, so Max and Megan. All right. And if you go to page 40, you can have an overview of the flow, if you will, of the conference. So obviously our date or time, length of time observed, we're typically 20 to 40 minutes. Now, as you'll see in the meeting, it begins by asking the teachers to reflect. What are the things they feel that they did well? Then we ask them to identify what they would do differently, given the same objective, but based on having done it. The length of time that they've been co-teaching, we want to know. We ask them to try to identify which approaches they used, share with them what we thought they used, ask about training and, very important, planning time, and remind them that best practice is a minimum of 45 to 60 minutes a week. Then we move to observer identified things that went well, what we thought went well. And then in the course of an observation, you wonder because you're dropped into somebody else's world. So you have wondering. Sometimes my wonderings are designed to try to get them to come up with something I'm going to suggest. So it's always better if it comes from them. And then it's share suggestions, and we typically try to prioritize those 3 to 5. Just like at the end of a good lesson, you want your learners to do the closure. What are their takeaways? What did they learn? Well, here at the end of this process, we are asking the co-teachers, what are your takeaways? So you'll notice on page 41, we've given you a sample of where the notes would be taken during one of these observations. And now we're going to show you the video footage of the post-observation with Max and Megan. What I can tell you is that in general, they had about 30 students in that class. There were students who were English learners. There were students who are eligible for special ed. There were students who were duly identified as part of the composition. All right. Now, what I also would love for you to look at is on pages 42 to 44. This is the coaching mastery session mastery checklist. So I gave you that very quick overview on pages 40, 41 of how the conference flows. And when we train our coaches and we watch our coaches, we use this as they go through. A lot of our new coaches take this with them into a meeting, and they are sitting there and they'll try to look at it and follow the sequence. And they explain to the people that they're observing that they're learning and practicing this process. All right. Please feel free to fill it out for what you see me doing. It'll be a great way for you to become familiar with this content of the coaching session. There you go. All right, here's Max and Megan. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and visit your class. And you've heard me say before, and I know that whenever I go to a classroom, it's shop. And I'm wondering from your perspective, what went well during that lesson?
I think that we were able to get through several different co-teaching models.
Okay, use several co-teaching models. Keep going.
And I also thought the kids did a really great job of following directions in terms of how to use the materials, how to listen to their partner, how to use the beanie baby or the talking stick, as we call it. Also, our kids are very musical, so they enjoy listening to the music and getting to move around.
Well, I think the kids definitely picked up on the social interaction that we were modeling. I saw them using that together with each other. So in terms of their social emotional development and how they learn to collaborate with each other, I saw that being present in the work that they were doing as well.
The students were on task and they didn't get off topic. And they also had really creative ideas. They weren't, and they wanted to share their ideas also.
Yeah, they were definitely interested in each other's thinking and their ideas.
So what I've heard you say went well is that you were able to use a variety of co-teaching approaches. Your students were able to follow directions for all the various tasks, that you used music and movement. The science concepts were beginning to be grasped by students, and they were using the scaffolds that you provided. And you also heard the students using academic language. You provided a model of social interaction, which is something that they picked on, and you heard them following that modeling and procedure in their own work. The students stayed on task. They were interested in the topic. They were creative with their ideas. They were eager to share their own ideas, but they were also interested in what their peers had to say. Very nice. Having done it, if you were going to go back and reteach that same lesson, same group of students, same amount of time, is there anything you might do differently?
Perhaps we could have placed the words in a different location, maybe on the board. We've got our 5 senses words on the board, and so maybe placing those words on the board as well, removing them from the actual card.
So what I've heard you say thus far in terms of what you might do differently is maybe take the sentence frame, the whole thing off the box, and or keep it there, but take the words that you put in and put them elsewhere, like on the board, along with the sensory words. Provide a stronger, clearer model. How does it help us move? So they've got that guidance. Invite them into the process of coming up with some sentence frames. Nice. In the snapshot that we got to share today, which approaches do you feel you used?
I think we definitely used the parallel model when we were monitoring our different groups. We didn't want to step on anyone's toes and kind of go to a group that someone had already visited. And then I also think team, when we were working together, going through the organizer, showing what good partnership would look like. And when Mr. Ryder was modeling the talking object.
Well, I was running out of room on my paper for all the things that I thought that went well. Well, thank you. So to begin with, you posted and you referenced your objectives, both content and language, but not once, not twice, 3 times. You came back. And what was so nice, you were involving students in that. It wasn't like, do you think we've met our objectives? It was, have we addressed this objective? Why? How do you know? When did you do that? So that avoids just, not really thinking about it and trying to give the teacher the answer that they want. Beautiful job of reinforcing the behaviors that you wanted throughout the lesson. It is a very business-like class with a relaxed, pleasant atmosphere. You teach routines and procedures. The kids follow the routines and the procedures. That doesn't happen overnight. So that's obviously something that been working on for a period of time. The fact that you built inquiry into this, I mean, it is science, but a lot of people skip the inquiry part. You engaged in purposeful monitoring and data collection. You provide supports for students. The sentence, having the talking stick. The high level of student engagement throughout your lesson. The use of the music and movement, but in a purposeful way. And then the group, regroup, so they hear and interact with a variety of students. It's beautiful. The student transitions were smooth. Your transitions were smooth. I too could hear some students using the academic language. That always makes me happy. You use student examples, but I was just wondering about different ways you involve them in their self-assessment.
So part of the rubric is actually a self-assessment. And so it's not attached to this, it's on a separate sheet, but it has them self-assess themselves, but also their partner too. It's not as detailed where it allows them to
Provide evidence
of specifically where they did that, but it focuses on behavior, organization, collaboration, communication, so those aspects. But that's a good idea to have them.
The evidence fits in really well for science too, since we teach them CER, claim, evidence, and reasoning. So that would be an example for them to use it.
It might also be helpful to have them kind of brainstorm at this point what a sentence frame might be to help them in this activity. And I'm wondering if at those times you can think of some ways to increase the level, because those were predominantly moments where it was volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers of students who did volunteer were a percentage of the class. What would be takeaways from the conferencing experience?
So one thing that stands out to me is definitely rephrasing how we ask the questions and kind of maybe giving the students warning as we're visiting them. Be prepared to share your idea, what your parent or what your partner is saying, instead of who can tell me or who can tell us.
Right, those quick moments of partner share, and then there's an expectation that everyone will be speaking and sharing it. I also think going back to the scaffolds that we provide, just taking a second look at any of the scaffolds that we decide to use with the students to make sure that we're not accidentally causing them to use them in a very restricted way. We want them to be more natural with their language. And so, yes, we want academic language, but we don't want them to be so constricted with the tools that we're giving them.
So what I've heard you say, takeaways, is to move toward rephrasing some of the ways that they're questions. Instead of who can tell me, the be prepared to share, building in the partner share as a support, and then building on that sense of accountability anybody might be called upon. And then an excellent idea of just going back and revisiting the scaffold. It's sort of like only as special as is necessary, because we sometimes have unintended consequences. They become too dependent or restrictive. And you can only know that by knowing the individual students and looking at it. But it's a great thing for any teacher and or co-teaching team to revisit. So it was truly, as always, a pleasure to get to see you guys. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Max and Megan. Now, Max and Megan don't always co-teach. As I said to you, he's a learning coach. And so he has periods of time where he'll rotate through and work with different teachers. They've worked together before, clearly. The process is really, the coaching is really based on trying to get the co-teachers to be reflective and asking them, we're back to whoever does the talking does the learning, whoever does the talking makes connection. It holds true here. We find that once people are familiar with this process, after they've gone through it, they seem to relax and get that this is not evaluation. It is very important, as on that checklist, and I hope you were able to check off many items, that there are moments where we are demonstrating active listening. Thus far, I've heard you say, we have to also become comfortable with the pregnant pause to give them that think time, to create the space for them to talk, right? And when I say, thus far I've heard you say, it doesn't mean I'm in agreement, but I'm acknowledging, validating what it is that they have said. We have time to show you one more coaching session. We won't be able to look at some of the lesson before it. This one will take us to 5th grade. And you'll see Cecilia and Amber. They had taught beautiful job of supportive, rotating lead, and parallel in math. They too have a class that is comprised of very diverse learners, including students who are duly identified. You have another copy of the coaching session checklist on pages 45 through 47, and we encourage you to use that.
I'm always grateful whenever a teacher lets me go visit their classroom. And I know that whatever I get to see is simply a snapshot. I mean, you are the two that live the video. You know what comes before, you know what comes after, and you know your cast of characters. But nonetheless, we did get to share that snapshot together. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what went well during that lesson?
I thought that there was high student engagement throughout the lesson, high levels of participation. Many students were raising their hands. Even if they weren't raising their hands and we called on them, they were still able to answer the question. And students felt successful. They felt that they had met the objective and that they were being self-directed learners for the most part.
I think that the way that we decided to keep our data, the observational data that we were taking, I think that worked out well. I like that we split up the class in half, so it was easier for us to reach all the students and to know if they really did meet the objective.
Right. I didn't feel stretched across the classroom. It was nice to have a general area to stay in. I felt like we were able to meet all of the kids who needed extra support or who were raising their hands. That was good.
So what I've heard you say thus far is you felt that what went well was that you had a very high level of student engagement. You had a high level of student participation. Large percentage of students were raising their hands. And even those who didn't raise hands, if you called on them, the non-volunteers, they knew the answer. You did an assessment with the students, and the students' self-assessment is that they met the objective and that they were working on their learner quality, and they had demonstrated that. You felt that the data collection was something that was easy and valuable. And the way you chose to do it was to purposely monitor different sections of the room, not both of you in free flow. What else would you say went well?
I think modeling the activity and having a student repeat the directions went well because students were immediately able to follow that direction. There were very few questions asked about what do I do next or what part are we on right now.
You had a high rate of response that the purposeful movement, the toss a question activity, allowed them to have a chance to get up, to move, and actually have some fun. Imagine math and fun. And the students knew what to do, and you could overhear some conversations where they were focused on that learner quality. Really nice. Now, having done this, if you had the same group of students, you had the same amount of time, you had the same objectives, what, if anything, might you do differently?
If there was some way that maybe we can differentiate a little bit more so that the kids that might need some more support, then they can have more of a focus area. Mm-hmm. And then those that need an extension, they can get that through the problems that they initially create.
What I've heard you say that you might do differently is to be perfect at all times and not make any error. But that error actually turned out to be great because they showed the students were engaged, they were attending to it, and that, as you said, we're all human. And then you're both focused a little bit on how you might differentiate a little more. So maybe one idea you had was for some students make fractions with single digits, and for others, maybe they could go to double digit. In the lesson that you did today, which of the 4 approaches did you use?
Well, we definitely did parallel because we were both observing one half of the classroom. We were looking for if the student met the objective or not. We were taking our data. So we definitely did that.
I agree the majority of the lessons parallel while students were working. We demonstrated team teaching at the beginning when we were modeling rounds 1 and 2 of Toss a Question. We were explaining how to do the activity while at the same time acting it out with each other. Also supportive at the beginning when she asked students to state the objective. I was taking note of those that were saying it and those that weren't. And there was one student who didn't say it. So I made sure to keep a close eye on him to make sure that he understood the content throughout. And then lastly, complimentary. We used several times while one of us was giving a direction, the other was asking a student to repeat it and writing on the board.
So basically, in a 35-minute lesson, you moved in and out of all 4 approaches to co-teaching. So good for you. Now, how long have you been co-teaching together?
This is our 3rd year.
We meet during a schedule planning time for about 30 minutes a week. However, we're constantly communicating throughout the day via email, or her classroom's right across the hall from me.
I think you were being way too modest. I think there were a lot more positives that came up. To begin with, you had your objective posted, you had it referenced, you read it as a model, you had the students say it. So it's not mystery learning. They know what the focus is. I noticed that when you were doing the choral response, you were monitoring the students to see if all the students were participating. So I thought that was excellent. You both did checking of understanding of directions for each other. And that'd be another complimentary moment when one of you gives the directions, the other is checking the students. Rather than paraphrasing them or saying something like any questions, you are actually finding out, do they understand the directions? The fact that you built that quick cooperative structure and Toss a Question, you could see that they were enjoying doing the activity. I also, as did you, appreciate your emphasis on the learner qualities, the self-directed learner. You built some other opportunities for students to talk to each other. You had a couple of think, paired, share moments. Your Toss a Question gave them purposeful movement, which is great for everybody, especially in the afternoon after lunch. You had bell-to-bell instruction occurring during the class. I would agree with you. You did have a high level of student engagement throughout the lesson. The transitions that the students had to go through were very smooth, but your transitions between co-teachers was very smooth as well. For the most part, you gave them think time when you asked a question before you solicited a response. I like the fact you had the challenge question. With respect to Bloom's taxonomy, levels of cognition, you had your students engaged at knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, evaluations, and synthesis levels. So you had them doing higher level thinking. That was excellent. Every activity you had was congruent to the objectives. It was very, very tight. One of the things that I truly appreciated was at the end, you spent time to process the academics, but you also processed the social skills, the learner qualities. And then the last wondering I had is, it appeared to me you were both collecting data. So I'm correct,
Right.
But what data were you collecting?
Well, we had split up the class into in half, and I was monitoring the left half of the room, and she was monitoring the other half. And we kind of just were taking notes of if the student is help meeting the objective, or if they still needed help meeting the objective. I also was taking notes on if a student needed extra help with multiplication, or if a student forgot to divide fractions correctly. I was kind of taking some observational notes. At the end, when we asked the students to rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 4, and when we asked them to give us thumbs if they met the academic objective, we would also write down those students that maybe needed more help with that or needed some more reinforcement.
I was thinking about the use of academic language. So when you're talking about lowest terms, and I think I heard one student say denominator, but you guys use the academic language, but how can you consistently get them to use it? So I thought maybe even in the beginning with the objective, if they could turn and talk to each other and say what it is, or the one that really stood out in my mind, you identified yourself when they were doing the third part of the prosecution to check with someone. It might be good periodically to collect data for each other as to who you call on. The way you structured the activity, the majority were kids who were raising hands. And I know that you were purposeful about not just calling on those that volunteer. But in an activity like this, it might be good to think about, or who we calling on, and or put in the use of the equity sticks or the randomizer so that you're sure it's not just the volunteers. So I'm wondering, in terms of next step takeaways, anything I said that might be a takeaway, and or things that you said about where you go next, what you do.
You just made me think of an idea that when we ask them to explain their thinking in any math lesson, when we ask them to explain their mathematical thinking, so that they aren't using such general language, provide a word bank, or even just jot down some keywords on the board that they have to use in their sentence. I think that would have allowed more of their responses to be a little more specific if you were required to use words like numerator or denominator.
I like when you gave us the idea of maybe using some more turn and talk so that the kids get to talk a little bit more before they answer. Sometimes it could be, kids might be a little bit anxious to just answer on the spot, but they feel comfortable with their peers. So it might be nice for them to turn and talk before we then go and ask the whole class. So for a response.
Good. I mean, basically both things you've identified are ways to scaffold in additional supports to support them. So having sentence frames or having a word bank when they're being asked to explain their thinking, and building in the think, pair, share before they're being asked to respond to the teacher. So I think they're two excellent takeaways. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
And hopefully you were able to identify many of those steps on that co-teaching mastery checklist. And again, as you move forward with doing your coaching, keep it with you. Follow the step scripts. Many of our co-teachers that we have trained do that. We oftentimes in training do gradual release with them where we model it like you've just seen and then maybe co-teach with them. So if you have someone who's done more coaching, maybe they could do this with you and then moving into from my turn, our turn into your turn. So
we want to thank you so very much for attending this session today and staying to the end. We've given you a lot of information for you to make judgments about what might be useful in your co-teaching and your co-teaching coaching. We hope you felt taken care of. You had some time to reflect, and you'll have some time to reflect afterwards. We gave you a little bit of home fun. We had fun. We hope you had fun. And, theory is great, but if you can't turn it into something practical, who really cares? So we hope you walk away with that. At least one thing that you were reminded of, something new, something that you wanted to share, something you want to try. So thank you once again.
And again, we will provide the PowerPoint in a PDF format, so you have that as well. So good luck in your journey with co-teaching and inclusion and coaching. Remember how important that performance-based feedback is. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Villa and Dr. Thousand. And just for those of you that are still here with us, I've dropped in the chat box a link to our website where you will find, along with Dr. Villa and Dr. Thousand's other resources to help you support English learners with disabilities. You will be notified once this recording and the accompanying resources are ready and uploaded. In the meantime, we invite you to peruse our website. Dr. Debbie Montoya, any last words for our group?
Just a huge thank you to everyone. I know how hard it is to stay engaged on such a late afternoon. Oh, and I see a friend there. Hi, Anjali. Friend. It's always nice to see friends and visitors as you come, and we hope that again we can be of a help and support to you all in the field, especially in these most challenging of times. So as again you peruse our resources on our website, and again a big thank you to Dr. Villa and Dr. Thousand for their support and being collaborative partners with us as we engage in this grant work as well. We wish you all the very best of health and wellness this holiday season. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So good luck, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening. Oh, you can enjoy the rest of your life too.
Yeah.
Days are so short. So.